learn about those facts. How the victim, Willie James, was bleeding from multiple injuries to his head. How the defendant was covered in blood. And how the defendant caused Willie James' injuries by hitting him in the head with a large metal flashlight. You also hear about the lies. How the defendant lied about driving all that night. How he lied about his use of a deadly weapon. And how he even lied about just owning a flashlight. But the defendant's lies did not disguise the facts written with blood. Good evening, Judge. My name is Stephen Lucky, and I, along with my co-counsel, Kinley Abbey and Matt Abbey. Abbey. Who are you guys? Stephen Lucky.
That was awesome.
Represent the people of the state of Lone Star. The defendant stands before you on the charge of first-degree assault, disorderly conduct for attacking the victim with a deadly weapon and for fighting. Today, you'll meet Willie James. This is Willie. He's a hard-working father and husband. He's a war veteran who served 3 tours in Iraq for our country. Today, he's going to get up on the stand. He's going to tell you that on October 2nd, 2014, he was having a little bit of a reunion with some of his high school friends. They decided to go to the old football stadium and watch the football team play. And afterwards, they got a couple of drinks. But Willie was responsible, and he gave his keys to his friend J.T. Sanborn. J.T. was the designated driver that night and drove Willie to the 7-Eleven so they could get a bite to eat. While they were checking out at 7-Eleven, they heard a crash. They turned around, and that's when they saw the defendant standing next to a bottle of broken glass on the ground. Willie looked at him and expected him to clean it up, just like he would have done. But when the defendant didn't clean it up, Willie felt bad for the employees. So he asked them, "Hey man, are you going to clean that up?" And it was very clear, the defendant made it very clear that that was not his job. And then he left the store. As Willie James and JT were leaving the parking lot, a car pulled out in front of them, blocking the exit. Willie didn't know what was going on. He got out of his car and he gestured for him to move along. Come on. That is when the defendant made a gesture of his own. He flipped him off. Willie walked over to the car, not knowing what was going on. He said, "Hey man, let's move along." But the defendant just smirked at him. Willie was frustrated. They were trying to leave. Their exit was blocked. So he hit the car. "Come on, man. Let's move along." And that is when the defendant struck Willie James in the head with a large metal flashlight. Willie fell to the ground, and the defendant wrestled him on the ground. Eventually, police showed up and separated the two. Willie James was bleeding from multiple injuries, had a fractured eye socket, and the defendant was covered in blood. But the defendant didn't have any visible injuries to himself. Willie James was taken to the hospital, and there stood the defendant, covered in blood. He never told the police that he had any injuries. He never told the EMS that he had any injuries. He never went to the hospital. He never even went to a doctor's office. In fact, he never told anybody that he ever had an injury that night until he spoke with his attorney. The facts were written with blood. And that is why the defendant stands before you on the charges of first-degree assault and disorderly conduct. Now, we, the state, hold the burden of proof in today's case, of proving all of our elements beyond a reasonable doubt. This is a burden that we embrace. In order to prove first-degree assault, we must prove that the defendant acted with the intent to cause serious bodily injury, that he actually caused serious bodily injury, and that he did so through the use of a deadly weapon. In order to prove disorderly conduct, we must show that the defendant intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly fought with Willie James in a public place. And today you'll see this beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond reasonable doubt does not mean beyond all doubt. It doesn't mean beyond a shadow of doubt. A reasonable doubt is not just a possible doubt. It's not a speculative doubt. It's not an imaginary or a forced doubt. It's a doubt that is truly founded in reason. And at the end of today's case, you'll see that the only reasonable explanation is that the defendant attacked Willie James intending to cause his injuries. Today we'll be proving our case through two witnesses. First, we'll be calling Officer Jerry McNulty to the stand. He'll testify that when he arrived at the scene, the defendant wasn't standing behind a car door. He was wrestling with Willie James on the ground. And when he separated them, the defendant was covered in blood and didn't have any visible injuries. And Willie James was injured so badly that he had to be rushed to the hospital. You'll hear from Willie James, the victim in today's case. He'll tell you that he wasn't looking for a fight on October 2nd, 2014. That the defendant attacked him. Willie James will get on the stand and he'll tell you that he tried to talk the defendant down, but the defendant was looking for a fight. Now, after we've called our two witnesses, the defense will have an opportunity to call witnesses of their own. They don't have to, but if they do, keep in mind, what facts are they trying to hide through their lives? After you've asked yourselves this question and reviewed all the evidence, we expect you to see that there's only one reasonable explanation for what happened. Only one conclusion. Don't allow the defense to wash away the victim's blood with lies. Find the defendant guilty, first-degree assault and disorderly conduct. Thank you.
Defense. Your Honor, may it please the court. Pete was a target from the beginning. He was targeted by William James because of the way he looked, by the police based on false assumptions, and today he's being targeted by the state. Pete Mitchell was a target from the beginning. Everyone ignored the fact that Pete was threatened, tracked, and terrified. And because of that, he did the only thing he could do. He defended himself. Good afternoon, members of the jury. My name is Morgan Barham, and I, along with my co-counsel Monica Bracy, represent the defendant, Pete Mitchell. Pete is a young man, just 23, who was born and raised right here in Lone Star. He went to school up the street, where he studied filming. He currently travels filming action shots of skiing and snowboarding. Not only does he film these sports, he participates in them. He's passionate about them. But on the night of October 2nd, 2014, Pete's passions were almost taken from him when he was attacked by William James in a dark parking lot, with his legs being crushed in the door. A man who Pete thought was breaking his legs. Now on that night, Pete had gone out to the bars with his friends, had a few drinks. He took a taxi home and then decided that he wanted to go out for some late night food. So he got in his car and he drove to the local 7-Eleven. Now Pete will tell you he made a poor decision, that he shouldn't have been driving. But that poor decision doesn't mean that Pete deserves what happened later that night. On that night, at some point while in the 7-Eleven, a bottle of iced tea was knocked off the counter. And Pete will tell you how a big military-looking man got in his face and ordered him to clean it up. But Pete didn't. And instead of Mr. James cleaning up the mess himself or moving on from the situation, he got in Pete's face and called him a worthless hippie punk and told him to F off. All over a bottle of iced tea. So, what did Pete do? He walked away. He left the situation. But the evidence will show that Mr. James, a man who's used to having his orders followed, didn't give up. So Pete went got to his car, he had to back up to leave the parking lot when a red truck with Mr. Sanborn and Mr. James came speeding up from behind. Pete froze. He thought they were going to hit him. He thought maybe they would go around him. Instead, the evidence will show that Mr. Sanborn and Mr. James got out of the truck and came running around to Pete's window, trapping him. Now, we expect Mr. James to take a stand and tell you that he was simply asking Pete to move. But I want you to ask yourselves, if Mr. James simply wanted to ask Pete to move his car, why did both men get out of the car? Why did two men go to Pete's driver's side window? Does it really take two men to ask a young man to move his car? So what did Pete do? He got on the phone and he called a buddy to be there to hear if anything, God forbid, were to go wrong. Members of the jury, something did go wrong. The evidence will show that Mr. James opened the car door and he began to yell and scream at Pete, telling him how ungrateful he was for the service that he and his buddy had provided for them, the freedom he had provided. People tell you this only increased his feelings of being threatened, trapped, and terrified. And it was at this moment, the evidence will show, that everything changed. Mr. James, a man who was used to having his orders followed, was sick to death of them not being followed. So he slammed that door on Pete's legs, crushing them, hitting them repeatedly, over and over again, trapping Pete at his car. Pete will tell you how he told Mr. James to stop, how he was being hurt, but Mr. James wouldn't listen. So Pete did the one thing he could do. He reached in his car, he grabbed the flashlight he kept there, and he swung over that car door, hitting Mr. James in the head, just to make him stop hurting him. Now, Pete will still tell you that he was terrified when the cops arrived, how he was nervous, and how the cops were treating him like he did something wrong for protecting himself. So Pete made another poor decision. He told the cop that he wasn't driving that night and that the flashlight wasn't his. But members of the jury, these poor decisions do not amount to guilt. Pete himself will take that stand and explain to you how he was threatened, trapped, and terrified that night. And today, he's here to tell you the truth. Today we are here because the state has charged Pete with first-degree assault and disorderly conduct. Today it is the state who bears the burden of proof, which means they must prove to you each and every element of all their claims beyond a reasonable doubt. The highest burden in our judicial system. Further, we have raised an affirmative defense, meaning not only must the state prove each and every one of their claims beyond a reasonable doubt, they must also prove that Pete Mitchell didn't act in self-defense. But today, we expect the evidence to show you that Pete responded to a threatening situation where he was trapped by two men and terrified for his life, the only way that he could, by defending himself. Now, keep in mind, we have no burden of proof, and that is because there is a presumption of innocence in our justice system. This means we don't have to prove to you or explain to you exactly what happened that night. That is the job of the state. And to try and prove their case today, the state will call two witnesses. They will call Officer McNulty, the police officer who responded to the scene. During his testimony, I want you to ask yourselves, what did he ignore on October 2nd, 2014? State will also call William James, the alleged victim, to the stand. During his testimony, I want you to ask yourself, what if the story doesn't add up? Now, after the state presents their case, we will have our own opportunity. But keep in mind, we have no burden. We will only call witnesses to show you how Pete was a target from the beginning, how he was targeted by William James, and how he's being targeted by the state today. First, we will call Kelly Bradshaw, the eyewitness, and she will tell you how Pete was in a threatening situation and how he was trapped by two men at his car door. Next, we will call Pete himself to the stand. By taking that stand, he's waiving his right to remain silent. He's taking that stand to tell you the truth about what happened that night, how he was terrified for his life, how he was trapped by these two men. Now, members of the jury, William James was right about one thing. He did protect the freedoms that Pete sleeps under. The same freedoms we all sleep under. And those freedoms extend right here to this very courtroom today. And those freedoms extend to Pete Mitchell. And Pete will be exercising that freedom by taking that stand and explaining to you the truth about what happened that night. He will tell you how he did the only thing